Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the RSIS Dual Book Launch webinar of Critical Reflections on China's Belt and Road Initiative by Associate Professor Ellen Chong and Professor Pham Quang Min, and China's Belt and Road Initiative, Impacts on Asia and Policy Agenda by Associate Professor Pradumna B. Rana and Assistant Professor Sian Pai Ji. I'm Nazia and I have the pleasure to be your MC today. May I now invite Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, to deliver the keynote address. Ambassador Ong, please.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you all. First of all, it is a slightly delayed appearance by me as I was trying to grapple with heavy rain outside. But anyway, I'm here now. Thank you all for your patience. This afternoon, we are here to launch two important books by two of our colleagues from RSIS. Both the books dealt with the issue of Belt and Road Initiative, but they have different emphasis and different theories, as well as the presentation of different facts. So I commend the book to all of you, and this afternoon you will hear more about the endeavors they have put in to produce these two outstanding publications. Before we hear them, let me briefly make a few points about the importance of these two publications and their subjects in which they will be providing you, the authors will be providing you with more detailed information. As you all know, the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, started about 7 years ago. It was enunciated by President of China, Mr. Xi Jinping. I believe it was 2013. And since then, there have been various adjustments to the emphasis as well as the implementation of the various projects under the BRI. But the two important points about the BRI is, number one, it is a major initiative on the part of President Xi Jinping of China, and he has to go across many different countries and bringing regions in the Asian, Middle East, European region together. So it is what we call a transcontinental initiative. And as you can imagine, this is not a straightforward task, and it has been facing different kinds of challenges in different countries, requiring certain adjustment as the program went along. So the Chinese authorities have adjusted this initiative from time to time to bring in more participation, to bring in more implementation of the necessary parts of different projects. The second point about the BRI is that it actually fulfills a very serious gap in what we call infrastructure development in many of the developing countries in Asia or Africa or parts of Europe. Yeah. So it is a new way of financing, if you like, infrastructure development, new way of creating connectivity for the people from all the countries hosting the BRI projects. So this overcome one of the fundamental problems in moving forward in infrastructure development in many of the countries where you see BRI projects are now blossoming. So those are the two important dimensions of the BRI. Of course, there are costs to be borne by people involved in the BRI projects, both the Chinese benefactor as well as the beneficiaries in all the different regions. And I'm sure many of you would have read about the analysis in the different media reports, specialist policy reports, and so on. So the key thing, therefore, is to try to appreciate how this BRI will move forward, how the recipient countries of the BRI projects can better organize themselves, work in a systematic way to derive the necessary benefit from the sponsors, the funding bodies from the Chinese side. And I think the value of these two books will be to give us an insight into how different countries, different governments, and different policy implementer beyond the country level try to put across the various BRI venture in a very palatable and beneficial manner. So there are two books. One is called Critical Reflection on China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is by Alan Cheong and Quan Minh Pham from Vietnam. They are both professors, expert in these respective issues covered in the book. The other book is China's Belt and Road Initiative Impacts on Asia and Policy Agenda. This was put forward by Pradopna Rana and Jason C. They analyze the BRI from another angle and look at various empirical sources, empirical evidence to try to set out the kind of impact that different BRI countries have received from the BRI. And they make certain conclusion that the BRI can be ultimately beneficial to everyone. So there is going to be more detail by the two sets of authors. I leave them to introduce their respective book. But I should take the opportunity here to also say a bit about the role of Singapore in the BRI. Singapore, as you all know, is a small city-state, and we can't be financing many of these projects that you are seeing in progress across the different regions. But Singapore is a business hub. We are also a center for transportation, finance, and all kinds of services related to transacting business and implementing projects. One of these would be the legal services and our capability and capacity for what we call mediation and dispute settlement. So China has established this BRI, but they also need various expertise in different arena, different services sector. And I believe Singapore has the setup, has the facility, has the expertise, has the knowledge to deal with some of these issues that you will get in the various BRI project implementations. In particular, banking and financial services have seen a lot more involvement. And I believe going forward, the other part of the services available in Singapore, technical skills, upgrading of workers' capabilities, as well as how to develop logistical provision and so on, will all have important role to play, and the relevant businesses in Singapore, the financial houses, the companies involved in technical aspects of infrastructure development are all ready to do more. I see great opportunity for our Singapore economy and our own Singaporeans' progress in the work of the BRI, and I think this is where Singaporeans can have better understanding of the various BRI ventures, the activities across the region, and we ought to be aware of some of the geopolitical developments as well as other kind of challenges facing the BRI projects, so that we are ahead of analyses and other kind of conversations regarding the role of BRI and the future of the sponsors of the BRI projects and the beneficiaries of the BRI projects. So hopefully RSIS, NTU, and all the Singaporeans tuning in will be able to get a better appreciation of the dramatic impact of the BRI and what it means for all of us going forward. I will stop here now and let you hear the two sets of authors introduce their books. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong. I would now like to invite Associate Professor Ellen Chong, Acting Head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS, to deliver the editor's summary of critical reflections on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Associate Chong, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Nazia, for the introduction. Now, it gives me a tremendous pleasure to introduce my book on behalf of my co-editor, who is unable to join us. Now, I take off from the alternative name for China's Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Roads, as it is called. So the cover of the book is actually a reflection of the road of inspiration that I and my co-editor, as well as the various contributors, have thought about. This was deliberately chosen out of a set of stock images for good reason. The revival of the ancient Silk Roads as the New Silk Roads, or officially China's Belt and Road Initiative, is meant to develop this landscape, which has been actually underappreciated all these years. All right, so this is a picture from one of China's many border crossings with Central Asia. And you see this undeveloped landscape is perfect for tourism. It's also perfect for building infrastructure, potentially perfect for dry ports, factories, new towns, and so forth, all right? Including research laboratories insofar as China and the partner countries wish to cite them there. Now, there's a third important person in this project, and that is the renowned and late feminist scholar, LHM Ling. She and I came to this informal agreement roughly a year after President Xi announced this initiative to say, hey, the idea of reviving the Silk Roads gives us an important historical moment to talk about connections within Asia, philosophically, theoretically, empirically, industrially, and so on and so forth. So we started talking about this, and I got my Vietnamese colleague, Pham Quang Minh, or Quang Minh Pham, involved in this project, and he very kindly co-hosted this workshop from which the papers for this book were drawn from, with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung based in Vietnam. So what is this book all about? It tries to address China's great power rise in relation to this grand vision of the Belt and Road Initiative in a very nuanced way. And I try to interest you in the chapter by my co-editor, Quang Minh Pham, and his co-author, Le Huangjiang, about phrasing, China's approach to the BRI in terms of a series of dilemmas. And of course, this is by no means a negative connotation, all right? Every grand project in world politics starts with a dilemma, and he's pointed out at least 4. And they make very interesting reading, and it does not pronounce, in any, ideological prejudgmental way as to whether it's bad for China or necessarily bad for the United States if the BRI takes off, and so on. It's just that there are a number of constructive dilemmas that one needs to take account of. And lo and behold, he also makes the point that although Trump seems to have attacked the BRI most recently in his UN speech a few days ago, if you look at the Trump administration's, ironic positions all these months, you realize that he has had some severe difficulty actually trashing the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, because it is simultaneously a way also for American companies to get in on their business opportunities along the revived Silk Roads. There's also a tremendous amount of investigation in the book chapters. Of course, not all necessarily address this question, but many do, of whether we can provide distinctly Asian and non-Western perspectives on the developmental orientation of the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is where I strongly encourage you to pick up the book either in the physical form or the ebook form to look at this dimension. And this is what you often don't read about in the mainstream Western-dominated press about the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, going back to the cover, which I showed you a picture of a short while ago, we're building, together in partnership with China, a lot of Asian and Central Asian and potentially Middle Eastern and European states are building unprecedented connections, okay, infrastructural, cultural, sociological, intellectual, where perhaps we are relearning the globalization of an earlier era, a more open era, I would think so. Okay, let me close my opening remarks by dropping a few interesting, tantalizing hints as well about the rest of the book's contents. Now, the first set of 2 chapters tries to imagine the Silk Road through philosophy and history. This is where L.H.M. Ling's posthumous chapter comes in. She's actually trying to suggest that if you look beyond the usual dialectic between China as hegemon and the whole idea of Silk Roads as an open source intellectual forum for exchange, you actually can think about a Buddhist approach to global governance and international relations, which is what the chapter is all about. Mine follows closely by suggesting that this is a cosmopolitanism built on travelers, okay? And the travelers I've studied from the so-called ancient world of the Silk Roads, of the original Silk Roads. There's Marco Polo, there's Ibn Battuta, there's Farsian, the Buddhist monk, who traveled incidentally from China to India. And in those days, nobody had nationalist hang-ups about, connecting along this Buddhist Silk Road. And finally, a very unusual read of the Maritime Silk Road by Tomé Pires, one of the early Portuguese so-called imperialists. But this was a thinking imperialist. So I'll leave you to check this out. And then we have a slew of 3 chapters looking at critical geographies of the road, and they're looking at critical geography in the sense that they are understanding the BRI in terms of how it's reinventing the idea of Europe-Asia connections, China-Central Asia connections, China-Middle East connections. And this is where we have interesting chapters like the one by Carl Thayer, looking at how Australia is actually pioneering a reconnection with East Asia through the BRI. Of course, I know that this is contentious given the recent spate of diplomatic incidents between Canberra and Beijing, but it's worth reading coming from Carl Thayer, all right, one of the esteemed academics based in Australia. And also there is a chapter by Manoche Doraj, who looks at Saudi, China and Iran-China relations and how these things actually have developed an understated momentum of their own. The next section of chapters looks at critical political economy on the road. And these also, take a microscope to how various countries that are either on the sidelines or actively involved in the Belt and Road Initiative are actually seeing this as a kind of conveyor belt, pardon the analogy, but it is reasonably accurate, of fostering growth and also encouraging onward investments to third parties into their economies. And I must highlight one chapter that I place under critical geographies, but can equally fit into critical political economy, the one on railway development by Wu Shangsu, who I believe is actually an audience member in this forum as well. Now, railway developments, again, one of those things that are either on the periphery or at the center of any discussion of the BRI. It's not straightforward imperialism in the traditional sense. It is actually very much developmental real politics, real as in R-A-I-L, in the sense that it can extend Beijing's so-called traditional imperial reach, but it also means that we are now interconnected more tightly than ever by landed rail connections. And this is something that I think in this day and age, pre or post-pandemic or during the pandemic, is sorely needed because it does not mean that if we've got shutdowns due to pandemic and other kinds of national and transnational reasons, we cannot trade. And railways actually can be very reliable if the politics can be smoothed out of the way and so on. And finally, again, because this original project was hosted in Vietnam, we could not avoid allowing a number of nationally derived perspectives. And this is also a strength of the mixed quality of the entire set of contributions. There are some distinctly policy paper converted into chapters, sort of writing that may not appeal intellectually in a straightforward way, but it gives you insights into the fact that for Vietnam, which is actually quite strategically placed on the Belt and Road, they've had this historic enmity with China, which predates the rise of the respective communist parties in both countries, and which continued, under the respective communist leaderships as well. And yet, for all of this enmity, the Vietnamese commentators are actually very nuanced in their criticism of the Belt and Road, and they see actually advantages in how Beijing's vision can be tuned to a very productive intra-Asian connectivity, and that's something which I think Southeast Asia needs with China. Okay, notwithstanding all the politics that divide us over the South China Sea and other border issues, there is a lot of potential if one is prepared to look at how economics and development can be put in a separate lane, okay, a more depoliticized lane from the highly politicized and very disputatious ones. Okay, with that, I close my opening remarks for now, and I welcome more questions later when I chair the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate Professor Chong. Next, I would now like to invite Associate Professor Pradumna B. Rana from the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS to deliver the author's summary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, Impacts on Asia and Policy Agenda. Associate Professor Rana, please.
Thank you, Nadia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I will be introducing the second book, China's Belt and Road Initiative, Impacts on Asia and Policy Agenda, written by myself and Jason, who is now an assistant professor at Renmin University of China. First, I would like to begin with a question. Why did we choose BRI, a difficult concept, right? BRI as a research topic. Well, at least two reasons. BRI was launched in the usual Chinese campaign style manner with few details. And as details are coming in, we thought we should try to understand and document it. So that was the number one reason. The second reason was to capture the views of opinion leaders from a broad set of stakeholder countries. I'll explain what I mean by stakeholder countries later on the BRI. This is because existing studies on the BRI, we think, has a narrower focus. They either focus on a narrower subset in their sample, or they focus on a few individual projects and comment on the BRI. So we have a broader focus. We are grateful, sorry, I forgot to, let me summarize. We are grateful to the MOE, Ministry of Education Singapore, for the research grant, which made Jason's stay in Singapore possible for 1 year. I have a PowerPoint, let me go to that. Super. Okay. In terms of contents and findings, the first chapter, of course, as always, lays out the objectives of the book. How has the BRI evolved? What have been its impacts, both benefits and costs on Asian stockholder countries? What policy actions should China and the stakeholder countries implement to move towards an improved BRI 2.0? In terms of methodology, we use a computable general equilibrium model. I'll explain what that model is. Then we use a perception survey and complement that with desk research and regional case studies. The first chapter also reviews the progress of the BRI project, which is labeled the project of the century. Chapter 2 focuses on the proliferation of great power infrastructure initiatives. Right after China came up with BRI, there have been a number of counter initiatives of other great powers. We have Japan's Enhanced Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, which was led by no other person than the present Prime Minister, Mr. Suga, who took over from Mr. Abe recently. We have India's sub-regional initiatives. Then, of course, we have the US's Indo-Pacific infrastructure strategy and the EU strategy for connecting Europe and Asia. Now, our study basically concludes that the BRI, in terms of financial allocation, BRI is in a class of its own, followed by Japan's EPQI. India, of course, has a dominant position in South Asia. Then we argue that even if some of these initiatives, not all of them could be realized, right? It is difficult. Even if some of these initiatives are realized, they could convert maritime Asia. Maritime Asia refers to Asia during the third quarter of the 20th century, focusing on the dynamism of Northeast Asia and the Southeast Asian countries, or even vertical Asia, into continental Asia, land-based Asia, through connectivity, going west, land-based connectivity. And through that, we would see the so-called Renaissance of Asia. So we argued that BRI could bring the world's center of gravity back to Asia once again. I have written a little bit of this on my earlier book in 2012, so we spell it out in further detail in this present book. In chapter 3, we simulate a computable general equilibrium, a model which is based on the so-called GTAP analysis, which is a world model, multi-sector, multi-country model, complicated model. And we find that, although both reducing transport costs, now reducing transport cost is the modality through which connectivity impacts on economic growth, both reducing transport cost as well as lowering tariffs would generate GDP benefits, but the latter outweigh the former. That is an interesting point. We also find that landlocked countries are the largest beneficiaries, as they could be land bridges and land links. So we're talking about Mongolia, which could be a land bridge between China and Russia. And we're talking about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, which could be, and are slowly starting to be, land bridges between China and Europe. And for the maritime Silk Road countries, we find that countries that are already well embedded in global shipping lines and supply chains like Malaysia and Singapore will benefit the most. In chapter 5, we conduct a perception survey of Asian opinion leaders. So what we did there was we developed an email bank of opinion leaders defined as policymakers, number one, number two, academics and think tank people, number three, businesses, number four, media, from 26 East and Southeast Asian countries that have signed the BRI MOU. So we define countries that have signed some sort of a MOU with China as the stakeholder country. So they have a stake in the BRI, and hence they are entitled to give their perceptions on the BRI to us. So we did not include China because China is the host country and the opinions there would be biased, right? My initiatives are always good. And we did not include India, Japan, and Australia, which have not signed the MOU, BRI MOU as yet. So aside from these, we covered 26 Asian countries, stakeholder Asian countries. We designed a questionnaire comprising 12 questions, 12 easy questions. We didn't want to overburden our opinion leaders because they are very busy people. If you ask too many questions, they will not respond. So 12 questions. We sent out the questionnaires to SurveyMonkey to over 16,000 identified opinion leaders for 1 month during June and July of last year. We tried very hard. We gave away, there was a lucky draw for iPads. We gave away 4 or 5 iPads, but we received only over 1,200 responses. But that type of response is not too bad. For earlier perception surveys, which I had conducted in my previous incarnation as ADB staff, also got similar results. So we got over 1,200 responses, and we are quite happy about that. Now, it will be difficult for you to see this slide, but it does show that most of our respondents were from Pakistan. So over 11% of the respondents were Pakistan. Over 10% from Singapore, because we are housed and we live in Singapore. Bangladesh, Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. And in terms of the composition of the opinion leaders, a brunt of the respondents were from the academic community, less from the policy community, only 23%, as opposed to double that, 56% for the academic community. We would have hoped to get more policy makers because we tried to make the book as policy focused as possible, but this is the best we could do. Now, okay, the first question we asked, I'll just go over some of the questions that we asked. What do you think are China's motives behind the BRI? Most respondents, most opinion leaders felt that promotion of regional integration, infrastructure connectivity, and economic development was the number one, was the major motive. Some felt that China wanted to assert its influence on international economic governance. So that was the second popular answer. China feels that, and it rightly so, it is underrepresented in the IMF and the World Bank. And that's partly the reason why China has established the AIIB. The third popular response to this question was to construct and control key supply chains and energy routes. Fourth, advance China's soft power. Fifth, explore China's industrial overcapacity. As you know, China, through its earlier development strategy, has overcapacity of steel, cement, iron rods, and all that. So it is exporting those to other countries, in its neighboring countries, through the BRI. And the other, well, the next most popular answer was to cultivate a Sino-centric regional world order. Others were less important. What do you think are BRI's likely benefits for your country? Now here the top answer was to expand trade, investment, tourism with China and other BRI members. Second most popular, BRI stimulates economic growth and technological advancement in my country. BRI closes my country's infrastructure financing gap, very important. ADB study has come up with an estimate of large amounts of infrastructure finance gap in countries. BRI strengthens political ties and trust with China. BRI contributes to regional stability, security, and prosperity. Okay. Then what are the potential costs for your country? BRI makes my country susceptible to Chinese influence. That, I suppose, goes without saying. There is no free lunch. BRI leads to an influx of Chinese migrant workers. BRI has negative environment and climate change implications. BRI companies disregard labor conditions. Sociocultural relationships are socioculturally upset. BRI does not entail technology transfer or capacity building. Debt equity swaps problem. So all those things. Then we asked them the question, is BRI a net opportunity or a net cost? Well, our opinion leaders were very guarded. Over 40% said it was too early to tell. But then, of course, of the other 60% who said they had an opinion, 40% said it was an opportunity. 18% said it was a risk or a cost. This is a very sensitive and important question, as you know. Debt trap diplomacy. Is China exercising debt trap diplomacy in your country? Again, not sure, but not sure is only 27%, about a quarter of the opinion leaders. 42% said no. China is not exercising debt trap diplomacy. It is not ensnaring countries into white elephants. 30% said it was China was exercising debt trap diplomacy. Final slide that I will show in this presentation is, will BRI be a win-win proposition ultimately, not now, but ultimately? And the answers were again mixed. 43% were not sure. 36% said yes, BRI could be a win-win situation ultimately. And 21% said no, it will not be a win-win situation. So those are the major questions and answers we got. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 of our book are what we call the regional chapters, BRI and Southeast Asia. This is very important because this is where the land-based economic corridors of China meet the maritime Silk Road. BRI in South Asia is also important, Trans-Himalayan corridors, CPEC from Pakistan, and BCIM. BRI and Central Asia. Central Asia is known as the buckle of the Belt and Road Initiative, connecting China with Europe, as I already said. Each of these chapters introduces the relevant economic corridor, identifies the major BRI projects in the region and their major benefits and costs. Our final chapter, the concluding chapter, chapter 8, is policy recommendations. They are based on the findings of our preceding chapters, including the survey. We have come up with 10 key policy recommendations that both China and BRI countries. We firmly believe that you need two hands to clap. So China should reform the BRI, so should the BRI recipient countries. So what are the 10 key policies that they should implement to move towards an improved BRI, as President Xi had promised that China would do at the BRI summit held last year? Let me quickly go over it because I'm running out of time, maybe in a couple of minutes. I cannot talk about all of this. First recommendation was to enhance the transparency of the BRI. It's very important. BRI has to be an open proposition. And in fact, this was the #1 recommendation proposed by our opinion leaders on what China should do. They had all said that China should promote transparency. What type of transparency? Procedural transparency in project selection, tendering, dispute resolution that Ambassador Ong mentioned about, dispute resolution, contractual transparency, use a standardized template contract, informational transparency, offer bilingual BRI project database so that people who don't understand Mandarin can also read the documents and bid for the projects. Number 2, strengthen economic and infrastructure governance. Governance is the key is the most important thing. And in fact, this was the #1 recommendation made by opinion leaders on what their country should do, improve governance. Without governance, there is corruption and BRI projects will suffer. The third recommendation is to secure the buy-in of major powers. As I already said, there have been competing connectivity projects of major great powers. Rather than competing, there should be complementarity. China could work more closely with, say, with Japan's EPQI and European proposals, maybe even the Indian one. Japan and Europe has shown some willingness to cooperate on the BRI. A number of joint projects in third countries are being talked about. With Europe, China has the so-called 16+1 mechanism, which I think has now become 17+1 mechanism with the entry of, I think, Greece. And China and other countries that have counter initiatives should explore third market cooperation, perhaps, or what China calls 1+1+1 is greater than 3 cooperation. Fourth recommendation is to multilateralize the BRI. So far, BRI is bilateral, only 2 countries. Even if the project runs through multiple countries, contracts are signed bilaterally. So we recommend that, we believe that China should partner and eventually maybe even co-finance with key international institutions, including multilateral development banks. That is, as you know, what the AIIB is doing. AIIB is not a member of the Paris Club or the DAC. China is not a member of the Paris Club. It has only observer status, and it is not member of the DAC. But nonetheless, AIIB in its operational guidelines uses the international best practices in making sure that projects follow international guidelines. So maybe China should follow such an approach for the BRI as well. Multilateral coordination and management of regional infrastructure projects, that is also very important. China has recently established a China Center for Development Finance and signed MOUs with the World Bank and a large number of regional development banks to work together. So these are steps in the right direction. Further strengthening of such measures would be great. Number 5, liberalize and facilitate international trade. As I already mentioned, openness seems to have a greater multiplier effect than reduction of transport costs. So while trying to reduce transport costs, China and the BRI countries should negotiate free trade agreements for tariff and trade facilitation purposes at the border. Manage risk of public debt distress. China and BRI recipient countries should select only economically and financially sound projects debt sustainability tests should be made mandatory under the BRI. China should adopt international best practices. I mentioned that earlier, right? All that stuff. The seventh recommendation is prepare a national infrastructure strategy. So countries should not propose BRI projects to China. Hey, I want this project, please finance it, just out of blue heavens. Those projects should come out of a well thought out, well developed national infrastructure strategy. Then the chances of success and the chances of it not being a lemon will be higher. Afghanistan apparently does such a thing. I was pleasantly surprised. So does Indonesia. Okay, and last three recommendations. Empower and protect local communities, very important. BRI should seek to maximize local participation and stimulate local economy. A lot of problems in CPEC about local people being unhappy and people attacking Chinese workers and so on. So that should be avoided. Put in place domestic preference scheme to encourage local sourcing. Protect and compensate communities affected and displaced by BRI projects. Do that expeditiously. Not only promise to pay to compensate, but do it right away. Our ninth recommendation is address choke points and missing links. These are very important because if you have missing links, they become the major constraint. So we have identified a few choke points in our book. Please take a look. One of them is the Kunjareb Pass on the Karakoram Highway. That is a choke point there. The other one is in Poland, between the Poland and the Belarus border and the choke point. So they need to be addressed. Because if you have a very nice highway, but you have a choke point, then you are stuck in the choke point, right? So they have to be removed. And the last, but not the least, the 10th recommendation we have is transform transport corridors into economic corridors. All the 6 land corridors and the maritime Silk Road that China has come up with are labeled as economic corridors, but they really are not. They are transport corridors to go from one point to the other, either by rail or by highway or expressway. The concept of economic corridor is quite different. Economic corridors refer to transport corridors plus industrial parks plus urban planning, urban development. So over time, China and partner countries should develop industrial and urban centers along the transport infrastructure to make them true economic corridors. Thank you very much. That's what I will end.
Thank you, Associate Professor Rana. We will now hear expert views from our discussants. First, may I invite Dr. James Dorsey, Senior Fellow at RSIS, to deliver his points on critical reflections on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Dr. Dorsey, please.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. Let me first congratulate Alan and his co-editor, Kwang-Min Fong, as well as Professor Rana and Jason C. on the publication of their books. Focusing on Alan and Kwang's book, it's great to see a volume that contributes originality as well as dimensions and perspectives to the discussion about the Belt and Road that are highly relevant, but often either unrecognized or underestimated. This book is about much more than the material aspects of China's Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, various chapter authors use the Belt and Road to look at perhaps the most fundamental issue of our times. How does one build a global world order and societies that are inclusive, cohesive, and capable of managing interests of all stakeholders, as well as political, cultural, ethnic, and religious differences in ways that all are recognized without prejudice and/or discrimination. In doing so, the book introduces a moral category into policy and policy analysis. That is an important and commendable effort, even if it may be a hard sell in an increasingly polarized world in which prejudice and bias and policies that flow from that have gained new legitimacy and become mainstream in various parts of the world. It allows for the introduction of considerations that I would argue are fundamental to managing multiple current crises that have been accentuated by the pandemic and its economic fallout. One of those is put forward in Lily Ling's chapter, in which she writes about the need for a global agenda to take the requirements of ordinary people into account to ensure a more inclusive world. The question is, how does one achieve that? It is a question that permeates multiple aspects of our individual and collective lives. If the last decade was one of defiance and dissent, of a breakdown in confidence in political leadership and systems, and of greater authoritarianism and autocracy to retain power, the new decade, given the pandemic and the economic crisis, is likely to be a continuation of the last one on steroids. One only has to look at continued Arab popular revolts, Black Lives Matter, the anti-lockdown protests, and the popularity of conspiracy theories like QAnon. All of this is compounded by decreasing trust in US leadership and the efficacy of Western concepts of governance, democratic backsliding, and the handling of the pandemic in America and Europe. Alan conceptualizes in his chapter perceived tolerance along ancient Silk Roads as stemming from what he terms mercantile harmony among peoples and elites rather than states. It was rooted in Alan's mind in empathy, a sense of spirituality, and a mercantile approach towards the exchange of ideas and goods. It was also informed by the solidarity of travelers, shaped by the fact that they encountered similar obstacles and threats on their journeys. And it stems from the connectivity needs of empires that build cities and roads to retain their control that Alan projects as civilization builders. There may be an element of idealization of the degree of tolerance along the ancient Silk Road and the assertion that the new Silk Road is everything that the old Silk Road was not. But the notion of the role of non-state civil society actors is key to the overall quest for inclusiveness. So is the fact that travelers like Fahisian, Marco Polo, and Ibn Battuta grappled with the very same issues that today's world is attempting to tackle: the parameters of human interaction, virtue, diversity, governance, materialism, and the role of religion. The emphasis on a moral category and the comparison of the ancient and new Silk Road frames a key theme in the book: the issue of the China-centric, top-down nature of the Belt and Road. Vietnamese scholar Trinh Van Dinh positions the Belt and Road as the latest iteration of China's history of the pioneering of connectivity as the reflection of a regime that is at the peak of its power. Van Dinh sees the Belt and Road as the vehicle that will potentially revitalize Chinese economic development. It is a proposition on which the jury is still out in a world that could split into two distinct camps. It is a world in which China brings much to the table, but that is also populated by black and gray swans, some of which are of China's own making. These include the favoring of Chinese companies and labor in Belt and Road projects. Although, to be fair, Western development aid often operated on the same principle. But it also includes China's brutal response to perceived threats posed by ethnic and religious minorities. That may be one arena where the failure to fully consider the global breakdown in confidence in leadership and systems comes to haunt China. That is potentially no more the case than in the greater Middle East that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Africa into the Chinese province of Xinjiang. It's not an aspect that figures explicitly in Manouchehr Doraj's contribution to the book on China's relationship with Iran as well as Saudi Arabia, but lingers in the background of his perspective analysis of anticipated changes in the region's lay of the land. Manouchehr focuses on three aspects that are important as one watches developments unfold. The impact of shifts in the energy mix away from oil, coupled with the emergence of significant reserves beyond the Middle East. Iran's geopolitical advantages compared to Saudi Arabia when it comes to the architecture of the Belt and Road, and the fact that China is recognizing that refraining from political engagement is no longer viable. It would go too far here to detail the evolution since Manouchehr wrote his contribution, but he no doubt sets a valuable framework for understanding them. By the same token, China's emphasis on state-to-state relationships could prove to be a risky strategy, assuming that the Middle East will retain its prominence in protests that seek to ensure better governance and more inclusive social and economic policies. That takes on added significance, given that potential energy shifts could reduce Chinese dependence on Middle Eastern energy, as well as repeated assertions by Chinese intellectuals that call into question the relative importance of China's economic engagement in the region, as well as its ranking in Chinese strategic thinking. The implications of the book's partial emphasis on what Allen terms philosophical and cultural dialogue reach far beyond the book's confines. They go to issues that many of us are grappling with, but have no good answers. In his conclusion, Allen suggests that in order to manage different value systems and interests, one has to water down the Westphalian dogma of treating national interests as zero-sum conceptions. One just has to look at the pandemic we are trying to come to grips with, the need for a global healthcare governance that can confront future pandemics, and the world's environmental crisis to realize the relevance of Kishore Mahbubani's description of the nation-state system as a boat with 193 cabins and cabin administrators, but no captain at the helm. Allen looks for answers in the experience of ancient Silk Road travelers. That may be a standard that a Belt and Road managed by an autocratic Chinese leadership that is anything but inclusive would at best struggle to meet. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. Next, we have Assistant Professor Gong Xue from the China program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at RSIS to deliver her points on China's Belt and Road Initiative, impacts on Asia and policy agenda. Assistant Professor Gong Xue, please.
Thank you, Nadia. First of all, I would like to thank Prof. Rana for having me here as the discussor of his book, China's Belt and Road Initiative, Impacts on Asia and Policy Agenda. As the title indicates itself, it is a book targeting at a wide readership that Prof. Rana has elaborated, for example, on researchers, policymakers, and business communities. As the icon IP scholar in RSIS, Rana was very passionate about this book project, as he's always passionate about his career. For the past year, if I can recall, he talked to me on this MOE-funded project in different occasions, in workshops, along the office corridors and bus stop. I was indeed expecting this book for a year since I found out the massive research efforts made by him and his co-author, Dr. Ji from Renmin University. So let me spend a few minutes sharing with you on what I like about this book and also add on some my personal opinions on how to improve this book. First of all, this book provides timely and relevant analysis on different aspects of BRI, including digital Silk Road in the region case studies. And second, this book gives substantial empirical observations on the following aspects. First and most important, it gives the comprehensive summaries of BRI in financing, progress and achievements, as well as governance structure. For example, on financing, in page 14, if you can see from the screen, the authors provide a very clear map of the relationship of multi-pillar financing structure of the BRI, and the authors were able to consolidate the fragmented information on the relationship between Chinese financing and international financing. And also, the authors summarized the key progress of BRI to give the reader an idea of the most achievable area in the BRI. So in the future, the policymakers in the host country can be informed of potential opportunities for cooperation. And as an academic, I personally feel we can tap into the summary of the research analysis to analyze various outcomes provided by this book. It could also help readers understand Chinese way in international development governance and draw lessons from Chinese approach, positive or negative. Third, what amazes me the most is the combination of quantitative and qualitative methodologies, implying it is a sound and scientific approach to understand BRI. What I like particular is on the survey methodology, with all the concrete design questions for the surveys are very helpful in providing disaggregated information on the receptiveness of China's BRI. And the summary of the survey findings are especially important for stakeholders in the BRI. On top of what I like about this book, I have two particular comments that I guess audience may also wonder or seek feedbacks from the authors. The point one, I think it will complement the understanding of alternative initiatives by the regional countries such as United States and Japan if the authors can include in-depth analysis on the impact of the whole government approach of the United States, for example, and how the US has been mobilizing like-minded partners in countering China's BI expansion. The authors in the book argue that the US International Development Financing Corporation will be expected to be limited in infrastructure power compared to China, and similar, perhaps Japan is the only one who can compete China in the region. Well, in my opinion, the US or the EU may not be the strongest in building, in terms of constructions and buildings, but it has been able to harness its those societal forces such as NGOs, international organizations, and activists to influence the decision-making of the host government, such as in the Jiaopiu Special Economic Zone case, where the Myanmar government relied on the American consultant and then accepted their policy suggestions by scaling down the project. And the United States can also use Japan as an offshore balancer to counter China's influence. So in summary, I think an in-depth analysis on this will be complementary to the arguments. And second, I think it is relevant to what the audience has raised about how can we understand BRI in a fluid situation, for example, in the COVID-19 pandemic context. Ostensibly, many existing BI projects are being on hold or delayed, while the others under negotiation seems less likely to proceed, while the Chinese government also started this dual circulation economic growth strategy that prioritizes domestic market. So do we still expect the BI to continue? I personally benefit substantially from the book as a scholar working on Chinese economic diplomacy. It is informative, scientific, and most important, enjoyable to read. It is definitely a book that you should not miss out. Congratulations, Rana and Alan, for these two wonderful books. I end my part here. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Professor Gongxue. We will now begin the discussion on the two books with Associate Professor Alan Chong as the moderator. Feel free to ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Panelists, please.
Okay, while I await further questions, and I will try to roll a few of the existing 5 questions into a few more targeted ones. Can I also invite the audience to direct some of the questions to the two discussants, okay? Because they have equally immersed themselves in the two respective books. So I think they are also experts in their own right, and it shouldn't be just myself and Professor Rana doing all the answering, okay? So we have roughly 15 minutes, give or minus a few more minutes, to take you to the answers to the question. All right, first up, I think COVID-19 and its impact on the BRI is something that's at the top of all of our minds. Let me roll those questions by Dr. Omkar Shrestha, Joel Ng, and Mr. Lee Chi Yang into one question about COVID-19. All right, very quickly, perhaps I should exclude myself for the moment. I would like Professor Rana to tackle this, and following that, perhaps Dr. Dorsey and Professor Kong Xue as well. Do you think that the BRI will be significantly interrupted by COVID-19? And one question by Mr. Lee Chi Yang suggests that for the moment, it seems like China is focusing on what I might term Keynesian style domestic infrastructure programs. All right, so quick responses, 30 seconds each by everyone, starting with Rana.
Only 30 seconds, is it, Alan?
Yes,
seconds?
because I'm encouraging more questions.
Okay, in terms of BRI and COVID, certainly BRI has been adversely affected by COVID because of the massive community lockdowns, number one, and also because recipient countries could not export their commodities. So debt service ratios increased. So many countries have requested China for reconsideration for debt restructuring and even debt forgiveness. Those discussions are ongoing, and I'm hopeful that the solutions will be found. And the BRI will continue. There's no way I see BRI slowing down. So what we are seeing now, I think, is a pause in the BRI move ahead. So I think it will be impossible to stop China. Sorry for being too optimistic, perhaps.
Okay, all right, Dr. Dorsey.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I would agree with Professor Rana on the debt issue, but maybe take a slightly more pessimistic view, or I would call it a more realistic view. And that is that we've already seen a recalibration of the Belt and Road in a number of countries prior to the pandemic and the economic turnout. Pakistan is which is the single largest country investment, essentially, is a clear example of that. There are other examples of it. I think the second thing that we will see is a reprioritization. So with other words, given the economic turndown, given the pandemic, that is, if you wish, unveiled priorities that were in the Belt and Road, but were not as premier as they are now. So I think you could see a recalibration as well as a reprioritization.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Professor Kong Xue?
Well, I think I echo with them, but I want to point it out, BRI is an open concept. Basically, the Chinese government can treat the narrative as in the preferred approach they want. So it is a format of Chinese foreign policy. But I think China will be expected to be selective in terms of financing. For example, the less critical markets will not see increasing infrastructure investments. That is almost for sure. And more controversial projects will be less seen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, still on the question of COVID-19 and China's domestic economic revival, I know this might range somewhat out of your expertise, but it's nonetheless worth pursuing since we are on the subject. Now, it seems like China's economy is reviving, and I've read a number of reports suggesting that this is the unusual, COVID-19, what called dividend. All right, if I can use this phrase loosely, China's stock market is experiencing a bull run, contrary to everywhere else. And there was also a lengthy report of all places, the New York Times, suggesting that China's industries, consumer manufacturing industries, are roaring because the whole world wants to buy. And they want the supply chains to deliver these goods, not just PPE and masks, but everything else to survive the pandemic while working and living out of our homes to the rest of the world. So could I have your thoughts, please? Again, we start with Rana, then Jim Dorsey, then Kong Xue.
About the Chinese economy, Alan, you are spot on, no? The IMF managing director was on TV this morning, And she said the worst is already behind us, at least in Asia. She was talking about Asia, not Africa and US and all that. So the worst seems to be behind us because China stock markets, as you mentioned, but also the real economy is going full steam, driven by both domestic demand and foreign demand. So these are the twin, there's a word for it, I forget what it is, I mean, twin engines of growth, both domestic as well as external. So it's not either or. But then she did warn that the signs of recovery are still tentative and we have to be careful.
Okay. All right, Jim. You have to unmute. You have to unmute. Right.
I would actually agree with the last thing that Professor Rana said. I think the jury is out. We are still in advance of what the economic crisis or what economic problems may be in China, but we're also certainly in advance of what economic problems elsewhere in the world are going to be. I mean, this is not played out yet. We haven't bottomed out yet. And so I think that ultimately that's what's going to happen for to make a judgment of what the impact is going to be on the Chinese economy, as well as on other economies for that matter.
Okay, all right, thank you. Gong Shui?
Yes, I think we've seen two very different scenarios of Chinese economic revival. On the one side, people were talking about Chinese investments in the new infrastructures that, those Internet of Things related, such as 5G, AI, ICT, etc. And we've also seen foreign capitals, particularly from service industry, they're venturing to China in contrast to, the concerns about the consequences of trade war. But there's the other side of this revival picture, which is the restructuring supply chain. China actually now is moving out of China, especially in those sectors that are vulnerable to supply chains and are vulnerable to the trade wars with the United States. And this sent a worrying signal. If you look at the Chinese domestic propaganda on food security emphasis, it is not a very positive picture. So I think it really depends on which angle you're looking at this economy revival.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, staying with the Chinese economy, apparently we have two questions. One from Frederick Kim from RSIS. This was rolled into some other question earlier, but let me just pick that strand out. Now, this is relating to all three of you as well. Do you believe that trade diplomacy is still a label that can be used anywhere, anyhow, to say, oh, China has mishandled a project in not just Sri Lanka, but potentially Pakistan, in any Central Asian country, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and so on and so forth? Is this a label that can still stick? Okay, that's one. Okay, let me roll in the question about AIIB. Again, I don't think I should limit this to Professor Rana. In fact, I would like to hear Gong Shui and Jim Dorsey talk about it as well. Okay, so just to recap, first question of this two-parter, debt trade diplomacy, do you think it's too glib and too loose a label? Number two, what role does the AIIB play in China's BRI? Thank you. Okay, Rana?
Thank you, Alan. Debt trap diplomacy, I think, is a great myth. That's what our study finds out. Let me explain why. We did some vulnerability analysis, vulnerability of stakeholder countries to debt trap, no? Using the methodology that was developed by Center for Global Development in the US. This method focuses on public and publicly guaranteed debt of China divided by GDP. So PPG divided by GDP. Now, the methodology is, if that ratio is around 50 to 60%, then okay, we need not be very much concerned. Emerging market countries, they have to borrow their capital scarce, they borrow 50, 60% is okay. The alarm bells start to ring when it exceeds that, no? So our analysis, using this approach in the book, we find that in South Asia, three countries are vulnerable: Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Maldives, right? So after having found that these three countries are vulnerable, we looked into the composition of their debt. Where did they borrow the money from? Did they borrow from China or elsewhere? And we find, for example, that Sri Lanka owes more money to Japan than to China. Sri Lanka also borrows a lot of money from international capital markets after their internal revolution was finished, right? They have access to capital markets. So borrowing from China is relatively less. Pakistan, you'll be surprised, owes more money to the World Bank and ADB than to China, even now, no? Even now. So such analysis led us to believe that Belt and Road, the debt trap diplomacy, while we must keep it in the back of our mind, I think is not as prevalent as is commonly made out to be. Now, and our survey results, Alan, survey results, as in the slide that I showed, 27% of our respondents had not made up their mind. But out of those who have made up their mind, 42% said no. And these are stakeholders speaking. For heaven's sake, we have to put the stakeholders on top, right, on a higher pedestal, no, than the analysts who write based on one project, two projects, somebody who focuses only on Hambantota port in Sri Lanka or a railroad in Laos and all that stuff. You have to look at the broad spectrum. I mean, there are bound to be a few rotten eggs in a basket. And there is a study done by Rhodium Group, which is also a think tank based in the US. They looked at the restructurings that were done under China's leadership. They requested China to do this. And they found that only one country, this project, Hambantota project, was a project where there was debt default. And Sri Lanka gave up this management thing to China for 99 years. Other projects are basically fine. So if you look at a broader sample, and if you listen to the stakeholders, then again, is a strong view. I think BRI is a myth. More recently, there was a study published by, just in end of August, published by Chatham House. And those guys say that economic factors are the primary drivers of BRI. And they also argue, interestingly, that China's development financial system is too fragmented and poorly coordinated to pursue detailed strategic objectives like debt trap diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rana. Jim Dawsey.
If I may, I'd go one step further than Professor Rana. I don't think that there is a articulated Chinese policy that aims to drive countries into debt. But what I do think is that both sides are responsible. With other words, you have governments that were irresponsible in the debt that they took on, and you had a lack of proper due diligence, perhaps for political reasons, on the part of the Chinese. And as a result, you're seeing countries countries with potentially significant debt problems, which could be detrimental to in the way they are renegotiated. But it's certainly not a designed policy for dominance that somebody in Beijing has sat around a table and worked out.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Kong Xue?
Well, yeah, echoing them, I want to point out 2 points. First of all, is the source of that diplomacy. If you can refer to Deborah Broadcom from Johns Hopkins University, she wrote a paper on this meme of that trap diplomacy by specifically pointing out it is a proliferation starting from India and then circulated to the White House. But needless to say, it reflects, the two different approaches of Chinese state capitalism and the West market capitalism. So that's one point. And second is, I think the Chinese government has already learned a lesson. It realized the consequences of careless lending that has been posing to its image. So we've seen recent moves from the Chinese government in terms of joining the G20 in debt relief scheme, and also China excused the debts of African countries that is to be mature by the end of this year. So those are the 2 points, but I want to add the 3 points, which may be a little bit related to the second question of AIIB. You see, there are totally different approaches, adopted by Chinese state banks or policy banks and the AIIB. So realizing the BRI has been tarnishing the image of AIIB, I've seen sort of, very subtle approaches by the leadership in the AIIB to detach from BRI. So you don't really hear much narratives on the relationship, how AIIB has been joining the BRI. But of course, the Chinese propaganda, they try to link them together. And the other thing is, there are different standards in the two banks. For example, on grievance mechanisms, you wouldn't see any of the public grievance mechanisms in the Chinese policy banks, but it is specifically and explicitly stated in AIIB. And the other example is the current president, Jin Liqun, this month just renounced the investment in the coal-fired power plants, a very unprecedented, movement in terms of environmental governance, in terms of the clean investment. And I think it is a result of cooperating with multi-partners such as World Bank and ADB or other international organizations. But such a scenario basically is rarely to be seen in Chinese policy banks.
Okay, thank you, Kong Xue. Now we are down to the last 4 or 5 minutes. Now this is a burning question. The United States, okay. Several people have raised this question, so I'll give a little bit of pause to all three speakers. Given Trump's, attack at the UN General Assembly speech about, nations on the receiving end of China's lavish infrastructure spending, what do you all have to say about it? And now staying with the US, there are several inflections about the United States and the Belt and Road. Dr. Joel Ng asked about the question of the tech bifurcation between the United States and China. How is this going to affect, rather, China's digital Silk Road plans? Okay, plenty to say there. And what happens, right, to the US position vis-a-vis the BRI? This is a question from Natanya Sia. If Joe Biden wins in November. All right, this is a lot to cover. And perhaps we should spin it around, okay? Kong Xue, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I have to digest these questions. They're good ones. I think certainly to a large extent, President Trump was correct that it is a lavish spending in overseas infrastructure for the past, at least for the past 6 years. It paused a little bit this year. We've also seen the outcries from a domestic Chinese audience questioning the Chinese leadership, why you have to spend that much money while, certain group of community, they're still suffering from the poverty. So I think it's true, but usually these kind of narratives, they also ignore the other aspect of BI, which can be found in the two books. Is about the development implications. There are some positive stories of BI, such as the special economic zones that China built in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and there are lots of academic and even policy papers, have been proving, a Chinese approach can be successful and can be replicated to a certain extent. But somehow, because of this geopolitical, reasons of those mimes, I think that's not healthy for the world development eventually. In terms of the digital Silk Road, I think it is it depends on which region Chinese capitals are venturing into. You wouldn't see too much concerns from this region when it's compared with Pacific regions, especially in Australia or those like-minded partners of the United States, to be more specific. And I think if the Chinese government is much less present in those overseas investments, it will be more accepted by the regional countries, whether it be here or in other regions. But of course, for the regions such as Africa, Latin America, perhaps I would speculate, perhaps they would be much less concerned about the security issues, while they probably would more acknowledge China's model of digital-driven economy, and that is the other way of economic development. U.S. position in BRI, I would really doubt. I don't know. I'm speculating. I would really doubt the new administration of Biden, if he's elected, will open his arms for the BRI, because it is almost for sure the Sino-US strategy competition is gonna on the rise. What is different is perhaps it is much more structured and it is much more institutionalized in terms of competition, where Joe Biden's administration may rely much on multilateralism, on institutions, etc. Thank you.
Okay, Jim.
The flippant answer to this is we're all waiting to see what happens in the US election in November. But I think that we know a couple of things, and there's a lot that we don't know. The one thing we really know is that there is, by and large, a bipartisan consensus in the United States on China. And therefore, China is going to be an issue whether Trump wins or whether Biden wins. The two things that we don't know, we all assume that if Trump wins, we're going to see another 4 years of continuation of what we've seen in the past. And yeah, if I had to place my bets, that's where I would put my bets. But fact of the matter is that the second Trump administration would potentially be about something else than the first. The first was showing that he could fulfill promises, that he was tough, and that he wanted to be reelected. The second is going to be about his legacy. And the question is what he wants his legacy to be, and only he knows that. I think the second factor is if a Biden administration comes to office, you're going to see, in any case, a difference in style. You're going to see a rebuilding of alliances and partnerships, which means that there's going to be a lot more give and take within that process. And so we don't really know how that's going to play out. So indeed, we're waiting for the elections. That's the only real answer.
Okay, Rana?
Yeah, Alan, the only thing I would like to add on Biden is, both are expected to be tough, as Gongse mentioned. But Biden has hinted on occasions that he may go back to some of the pre-Trump policy of engagement with China. I thought I read about it in several places, but as wisely advised by James, we just have to wait and see. Wait and see. So he cannot be worse. The question is, can he be better? We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm asking events if we can go over the time limit since we started a bit later by 5 minutes, and I assume that we can. All right, we have a question from our own RSIS colleague, Soo Hyun. She's asking if we would like to say something about the link between the effects of the BRI and on political stability within recipient countries and development outcomes in those particular countries. I suspect this is linked to her own research as well. And tag on to that, she's asking whether Chinese development aid actually offers a very contrasting model to that offered by Western donors. Okay, so this is something which all three of you have touched on in your comments earlier, but perhaps you'd like to focus it, up front and center in this round. Okay, we have 5 minutes. Please go ahead. Please keep your comments to 30 seconds each and leave me just a little bit of time to provide closing remarks. Okay, go ahead. Who wants to go first? Perhaps I should try Jim for a change.
I don't want to duck the question, but but I think that it really is a case-by-case basis. And a lot is going to depend not only on the character of the development policies, but also on political developments. I think that's true for Central Asia. I think that's true for the Middle East. I mean, those were the black and the gray swans that I was referring to. But obviously, if you have a well-designed development policy that ties into the Belt and Road Initiative, that in and of itself is going to be a positive development. but then you need governance, you need guarantees against corruption, you need transparency, all of the things that Professor Rana mentioned, and you need political stability. And that is something that I think we'll have to wait and see how major a commodity political stability is going to be in the years to come.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Rana, are you ready?
Well, yeah, I mean, on this question of political outcomes, I agree with Jim. I mean, it depends on the policies of China, it depends on the policies of the recipient countries, and more importantly, governance system. Governance is very important because this Chatham House study that I alluded to earlier mentions that in Sri Lanka and Malaysia, the two most widely established victims, or talked about widely cited victims of the death trap diplomacy. I didn't know that Malaysia was cited as victim of death trap diplomacy. But anyway, they had this East Coast railway line, which the size of which was reduced after Prime Minister Mahathir took over. The most controversial BRI projects were initiated by recipient governments. So the quality of governance is very important, and outcomes will depend very much on good governance, political outcomes, I think. I don't know if that answers Suyon's question completely, but that's what I would like to say.
I think that will do. In the interim, perhaps you could start a separate channel with you after this.
Yeah.
All right, Gong Xue, I think this is what your research is about, right? Contrast between Chinese and Western aid models and everything.
Yeah, it's sort of, but I'm not really working on the impacts on the political stability. Well, I provide my shallow opinions, which I think the BRI, well, it's a mixed outcome. You cannot, boldly argue, BRI has been, unnecessary turmoil in the political stability. It's kind of like a trigger, but the thing is, it definitely touched upon to the point of the governance issue where James and Rana have shared with us. I think the way to understand the two contrasting model is first of all is to look at how they understand development. Okay, from all the research on Chinese model, you find out the flexibility, accommodation, experimental aspects are very ostensible, either its own domestic economic development or in its overseas FDI infrastructure investments. And in terms of measuring development, I think the Chinese, particularly, attaching importance on the GDP, the income, those tangible results, while much less on those intangible, measurements such as freedom, such as, human rights, environmental, issues, land appropriation issues, things like that. So, but, on the other side, China, I think, also represents a voice. It's not a particular China thing. It represents a voice from developing countries in the sense that they may wonder why they should adopt the Western standard, why they cannot just come up with their own approach, experiment it, and implement the best practice if they are able to have one eventually. So to tackle your question, I think eventually we should do a bit more research on the impacts of the standards in terms of projects, how those standards have a long-lasting impact. And what are the measurements, whether they are, hardcore GDP income, or they are, as I said, intangible, index of happiness, for example. I hope I addressed your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'd like to just respond to just a comment by Mr. YC Tan. He says on the Q&A channel, perhaps the author should consider sending French officials a copy of their books. Okay, if I look at the attendance list, I think there are members of the French government on our audience list. So, well, if they could get in touch with us, we'll be happy to send a copy to them and so on. Thank you very much for your comments. Now, let me now quickly segue to my closing remarks. I personally want to thank Jim Dorsey for such positive and encouraging remarks on this book. It has indeed been a road of tremendous discovery for me. Obviously, I could not have lived in the ancient Silk Roads, but I have discovered a lot that I would like to go back to in terms of my research on Asian political thought and IR theory and so on. And what I take from James' comments, which in a sense provides an initial wrapping for my closing remarks, is that reflecting on the BRI is like reflecting on the global order in crisis. There is a need for a new collaborative spirit and more research to be done beyond the usual narratives about blaming China for the issues that do not make the BRI progress smoothly. And the BRI, okay, if you look at it objectively from a political economy or even a domestic politics perspective, is about reigniting a debate about what development means, or what nations collaborating together can do to achieve what the UN calls the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, that is a phrase, again, perhaps in a follow-up seminar we might deal with it. Most importantly, we need to look beyond the standard narratives saying that the BRI is either very good or very bad. Is it completely in the favor of China, self-serving for China, and anti-United States, anti-the EU and so on? I think we need to move beyond that. And I take this point nicely away from the Q&A as well as from Rana's own presentation. The BRI is actually very strategically advantageous and empowering for recipient countries, not just for China. Even though it is vast and open-ended, the national development plans, the national infrastructure plans, which is Rana's phrase, needs actually strategic planning on the part of the recipient countries in order to strategize to get the most out of this partnership with Beijing. And he makes the point, the following on point about frictions in the flows of financing and aid expertise and the deployment even of Chinese workers. I note this well-cited article from the New York Times by Mr. Lama, suggesting that China is in fact reprising some form of new colonialism because it sends its workers to work on these projects to the detriment of the employment of the locals. Again, it's a point which Rana's book highlights, and you should get a copy of it to look at the survey results. But you see, this is where I think we need to look beyond the narratives of cynicism to appraise it. Did the recipient countries in the first place stipulate clearly in the agreement with China that a certain percentage of workers involved in certain of these projects need to be hired locally, the so-called national preferences in domestic labor market, stipulations and so on. All right, and I think Gong Xue made this interesting point about how some of the frictions of the BRI actually stem from this encounter, not necessarily a harmonious encounter, between China's state market model, state capitalist model, and the version circulated mostly by the existing liberal international order of market-led capitalism. Now, when these two meet, sometimes the expectations are different. So it is so easy to say, oh, this project is debt trap diplomacy, that project is not transparent, and so on and so forth, because the expectations are just different. And certainly, I think COVID-19, to wrap up the final point, a number of questions, expectedly asked about it, is that I think most of my commentators and book authors would agree that it is an important hiatus, but it does not, permanently derail the BRI. It may set it back. But then you see, if you look at the stock markets and Chinese economic performance right now, you look for the brightest and the most loudly whirring engines, whirring as in W-H-I-R-R-I-N-G, engines of growth. China and Southeast Asia are largely the only games in town at the moment. Everywhere else, I think they're still under some degree of pandemic-induced lockdown. And again, this is outside this webinar. But if you look at the curves, if you can draw a curve, where on one axis, you have economic growth. And the other axis, you have worries about the pandemic. You realize that, you know, if you want to diminish worries about the pandemic escalating into food crisis, employment crisis, and so on, you know, it has to go upward. All right, and that's where I think the BRI is important. We all need to wish it success so as to serve as the locomotive that will engineer our recovery, our economic recovery from COVID-19. Okay, that will be my last comment, and I hand this over to the MC, please.
Thank you, Associate Professor Alan Chong and panelists. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the RSIS Dual Book Launch webinar.